What if I told you that the greatest war in all of world history was fought by hiding in holes, all because some dude eating a sandwich decided to kill a world leader? Those details are coming up next. In our last video, we covered the causes of World War I, or the Great War. And it was all tied back to the assassination of one guy, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The shot heard around the world, and nothing will be the same after. In the wake of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, by fall of 1940, almost all of Europe was at war, divided between the Triple Entente, England, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. No war before it had been fought this way, and no war after would be. Warfare truly changed during this time. There are many reasons to this. We can attribute much of this to the militarism and nationalism that we talked about in our Causes of World War I video, but maybe the most important contribution to this is the Industrial Revolution and the rise of new technology. Technology has changed the way weapons work and the ways wars are fought. So because of that, World War I is very different from the wars before it because we have so much new technology that came in and changed weapons. That is our focus today, the life of a soldier and the way in which this war was actually fought. We'll get into the stats and details of the end of this war later on, but for now you need to know that this war was a complete and utter disaster. Nobody was prepared for the damage that would be caused by this war. Again, as we talked about in our causes video, people were hyped up and excited for this war. They thought it was going to be an adventure and that it would be over by Christmas. That's like 3 months. Yeah, come on, in and out. Quick 20-minute adventure, let's go. But boy, were they wrong. The actual war was completely unexpected and definitely a disaster. Much of that is ignorance. Much of that is also the rapid rise in technology that we're going to feature today. Industrial technology provided new weapons that were capable of causing more damage and taking more human life than ever in human history. And I'm going to outline several examples of that today and explain how they contributed to this terrible state of World War I. The first and probably most apparent change in World War I, right at the start of the war, is the use of long-range cannons. The fancy historical word for that is artillery. Now, cannons are nothing new. Gunpowder had been developed way back by empires like China, and cannons had been used in Europe in as early as the 1400s. But artillery took this gunpowder and this explosive style of combat and mechanized it.
Artillery were large cannons that allowed armies to attack enemies that were hundreds of miles away. And the ensuing explosions not only resulted in casualties to soldiers, but also to civilians and destroyed important buildings and barriers.
So really, artillery extended the range at which we could attack people and increased the damage that could be done in war. But there were other weapons too. Such an example is the machine gun. This was a relatively new invention during World War I, and it allowed for bullets to be shot at unprecedented rates.
Machine guns in World War I could fire up to 400 rounds per minute, which created walls of bullets that would stop an enemy in its tracks. Machine guns certainly changed the rate of speed at which wars were fought, while creating more distance between enemies and making the front lines even more deadly than they were in the past.
Both artillery and machine guns allowed for armies to very easily defend their territory. Because if you moved at them to attack, you were either going to get blown up by artillery or mowed down by machine guns. It's extremely deadly. So there's not many ways to fight this war without massive casualties. Because of this, Europeans did the only thing they thought they could do. They hid from all the bullets. Literally.
Trenches had been used as early as the Middle Ages as armies would wait out their opponents and try to starve them out under the protection of such trenches.
It made logical sense. Dig a hole in the ground so that the enemy's fire goes over your head and wait them out. Eventually they'll go away. That's why trench warfare is the biggest part of World War I. It's how most of these battles were fought, especially in the Western Front as Germany advanced towards Paris. The French and the British built up a massive network of trenches to try to slow down Germany and wait them out. So trench warfare is a very slow style of war because the only way you advance is you get out of your trench and you dig another trench. You can't just charge. You're going to get mowed down by machine gun fire. This calls for a lot of waiting. Now, as militaries got more and more impatient, eventually they would try to get out of the trench and charge towards the enemy. But the land between these two trenches, since both sides had them, was basically up for grabs. Nobody could ever really take it. We called it no man's land because of this. Going over no man's land was basically the same as a death sentence. Not only were you advancing directly into the fire of your enemies, the land itself was destroyed and desolate, often full of giant craters and potholes that would fill up with water that you could drown in, or covered with barbed wire and booby traps meant to keep you from actually making it to that end destination. It's brutal. Because of this, World War I, especially on the Western Front again, is typically considered to be a war of attrition. And there are a lot of stalemates that take place as nobody's really gaining or losing ground. This all happens because of the advances in technology, especially machine guns and artillery. The only way to keep people safe was to be below ground. So it seemed like the logical way to do things. And yet the result was a poorly managed war that resulted in so many casualties. Not to mention how rough it was both physically and mentally for the soldiers at war.
Life in a trench was absolutely brutal. Soldiers would wait in fear and anxiety on weeks on end with no military action, and had little to no shelter from the elements and the weather. But at the time, trenches were the only strategy that could have been used to protect from artillery and machine gun fire, and therefore categorized most of the fighting in World War I, especially on the Western Front.
Trench warfare is clearly a flawed strategy. And yet, as technology continues to progress during the Industrial Revolution, new military technologies will emerge specifically geared to getting past these trenches. The most obvious example? Flight.
Advances in flight revolutionized fighting in World War I. While flight time and height were limited by these new airplanes, this technology allowed for armies to see over enemy trenches and get valuable pictures, and eventually drop bombs and attack from the air, making trenches almost obsolete.
But the planes of World War I were pretty crude and ineffective. And while they certainly had their uses, they alone did not end trench warfare. It wouldn't be until World War II that we truly see planes as a factor both in transport and in military fighting. Many countries raced to find new ways to get past the trenches, and the British had one specific invention that really changed this.
Tanks, or heavily armored vehicles, were developed during World War I as another answer to trenches. These were all-terrain vehicles that could safely travel over the desolation of no man's land and provide protection from enemy fire.
Tanks were truly a game changer. They were basically moving fortresses that ensured protection at all times and carried some pretty wicked firepower. It would be the key to ending this war, but we'll talk about that in a later video. Other countries got a little bit more creative in the ways they combated trenches.
Many armies in World War I, especially Germany, began releasing poisonous gas or mustard gas into enemy trenches, effectively smoking armies out of trenches.
It's truly a silent killer. The introduction of chemical warfare into world history. Like we said, wars will never be fought the same. And I think it's pretty clear that life for a soldier would have been brutal. There were so many different threats to not only your comfort, but also your mentality, and more apparently your life. World War I didn't just affect the soldiers. World War I is truly a total war. In total war, your whole society is mobilized or participating in the war effort. And there's different reasons for this. The entire country was necessary for success in this war, hence the word total.
Back on the home front, industrial factories were converted into factories to produce military weapons and materials. This ensured all citizens, including women and children, had a role to play in the war effort as they worked in these factories to produce these goods.
It's definitely a continuation of the changes we saw in overall society during the Industrial Revolution. Now that's even more apparent because the factory system is so in control and absolutely vital to success in the war. So therefore, everyone had to participate in order to produce what the soldiers needed to be successful. And if you weren't participating in these factories, the war was still on your mind. This war was being fought outside of major cities in Europe. And on top of that, governments, because of what we've talked about already with nationalism, wanted you as a citizen to know why they were fighting and wanted your support. The result of that is special advertising called propaganda, something you may already be very familiar with.
Propaganda was advertising that was used to sway public opinion in a certain direction during the war. It often generated nationalism in support of a given country's war effort. And it was also used to encourage civilians to join armies and participate directly in the war effort.
Propaganda tried to inspire certain thoughts and feelings about the war into everybody's brain. So by using visual advertising or even radio advertising, everybody had an opinion about the war and everybody kind of knew what was going on. This is a new concept. So because of propaganda and overall knowledge and understanding of what was going on around them, World War I is a total war because people are directly involved. But unfortunately, people were even more directly involved than they would have ever liked.
Cities like London were viciously bombed through aerial attacks, leading to unprecedented rates of civilian casualty, an unprecedented amount of damage to economic centers and the infrastructure of cities.
And therein lies the true tragedy of World War I. War was brought closer to home than ever before. Civilians were a factor, whether they wanted to be or not, had to participate. Oftentimes, they were attacked as well. The destruction to Europe, whether it be farm fields or cities, was unprecedented. In the past, wars had been fought in a way that was separate from society. It was viewed as a spectacle or sporting event. Now war hits close to home. It doesn't matter who you are, it's going to affect you. That's the tragedy of World War I. And World War I shows us so much more about what humans can do to each other at our worst. It's not just the fact that people are dying, it's that we have invented ways to kill them in mass amounts, and in pretty gruesome ways too. It's for this reason that President Woodrow Wilson, the US president at the time, once said that this was a war to end all wars. Nothing could be worse. And yet, as we'll see, there is something that is worse, but that's a story for another day. War is awful. It always has been. And yet, for whatever reason, World War I found a way to make it worse. The famous American author Ernest Hemingway, who experienced much of this war firsthand, said this:
"Never think that war, no matter how necessary nor how justified, is not a crime."
We can debate back and forth all day whether or not the causes of World War I were actually justified. The means that this war took on were right. But Hemingway brings up a great point. War, no matter what, no matter how necessary, no matter if it's for protection or something else entirely, it's wrong. It's a crime. It's violence against our fellow man. And yet how powerful of yet another reflection of how sinful we are and how badly we need Jesus. So in the horror of World War I, there's also hope. Because World War I did end. We'll get those details later on. Just like everything else, World War I was temporary. We do have hope that despite how horrible we are and how sinful we are and how we treat one another, we're redeemed through Christ. That's the power of World War I. And I encourage you to continue to think about that as we unpack World War I, that there is hope. There is always hope. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.